This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On Air. In today's episode of Rewilding in Action, I find out how rabbits are impacting on both the understory as well as the trees of native bush, and how one couple has really knocked them back to help the forest naturally regenerate. This episode of Rewilding in Action is sponsored by the Opera, Otago Peninsula Eco-Restoration Alliance. The Opera is a private eco-reserve dedicated to conservation, rehabilitation, restoration and education. You can find out more about their tours on their website, theopera.co.nz. Kia ora, welcome to Rewilding in Action with me, your host, Maureen Howard. This time, I'm at Varley's Hill on Otago Peninsula to visit with John and Moira Parker, who have put 90% of their 40-hectare property into protected covenants. Although they've done a small amount of tree planting next to the tracks and close to the house, the vast majority is in various stages of natural regeneration. I asked John and Moira to describe their covenanted pieces of bush.
We're between Hoopers and Papanui Inlet, 40 hectares, 90% of which is covenanted, and we are restoring the native bush.
So when did you come onto the property originally?
93? Yeah, so it's 30 odd years, yes.
The high point is Varley's Hill, which is 134 metres, and it straddles the two inlets. So you can see this hill, this green hill. You see it very well from the high road, actually. Looking across, you see Varley's Hill, and then there's Hoopers Inlet on one side, Papanui Inlet on the other side.
It really is outstandingly beautiful. A little bit of wind.
We have a hill that that faces all points of the compass, really. One can always get out of the wind, if there's a job to do, and there usually is something to do. We've just walking down, we've found a culvert completely blocked up that needs to be cleared. One can always find sheltered, calm working conditions.
Well, that's very good. And also then, ecologically, you have different growing conditions on your hill.
That's correct. I think one thing that has made a difference is that on the northeast facing slope, that's the slope above Papanui Inlet, there is bush. It shows on a map from 1901, and in there we have some very big mature totara. They have been a wonderful seed source. In there, completely sheltered, whatever the wind is doing. There's also some very old nio, and we have a few groves of old kowhai tree. The rest is pretty much Kānaka at various stages. So on some of the dry ridges, there are Kānaka stems which are packed close, nothing on the ground. Other places, there are Kānaka that you can hardly get your hands around. In under there will be a lot of mahui, but other species as well. Matipo, Lophomotus, quite a few other things too.
And so it'll be really interesting to see what's coming up. And I know you've a deep interest in plants, Moira. And John, you've been taken along partly for the ride, haven't you?
I think is the word.
Yes. But you're enjoying the journey.
Oh, indeed, yes. It's a fun place to live. And it's exciting to see what happens over time, especially with minor interventions like getting rid of the rabbits. To see what's happened there is extraordinary.
This is what our main topic is today. But before we talk more deeply about the rabbits, just to tell me a little bit about what it was like when you first came, so in 1993.
In 1993, the landowner leased the grazing, and it was grazed by cattle. Underneath the Kānaka canopy, there was nothing. It was simply bare ground. I now wish I had taken more photos of just bare ground, but somehow one doesn't. Exclude the cattle. Oh, the ferns, a lovely variety of ferns. They were the first things to come away.
Right.
Followed closely by coprosmas. It took a little while, I think, for tree seedlings. let's face it, you've got a seed in the ground. It takes a little while for the pittosporums, the mahoi, the nio to actually develop to, say, sapling and a small tree size. But it does happen, and sometimes I look at things and I have to remind myself it's 30 years that this has taken. So something that simply wasn't there when we first came is now a sizable tree.
But we look back, it actually does happen relatively fast, doesn't it?
It does. You just have to be patient. I think because this was quite a big area to manage, there was always quite a lot to do. So I was never looking out and thinking, oh gosh, that's taking a long time. And to be honest, I didn't really know what would happen. I had a little bit of experience with Covenant. It's actually the first QE2 on the Otago Peninsula, Styles Creek bush. When that was fenced from stock, we saw the changes. Something that we did learn from that was you don't just have to exclude the stock, because the sheep or the cattle, they've been eating all the tree seedlings, all the things you want. They've also been eating the seedlings of the weeds. There's things to do as a result of excluding the stock, and certainly at Styles Creek bush, banana passion fruit came away. The birds have perched, they've been feeding on banana passion fruit, and they've dropped the seeds. So there are particular places that one has to target all the time to find the seedlings. Our aim here is to try and find it before it fruits, but it's constant, and I think we are having to put more time and effort into that, having taken out the rabbits. How ironic is that?
Right, so that's really interesting, because yes, there's all these unintended side effects when we change the ecology. And so, John, you've actually got 2 covenants. So what are the 2 covenants, and when did you get them, John?
Very early on. I think the first one was about 2 years after we purchased, and then the second one was much later, because we've gradually added to the area covered. We bought 2 additional pieces, and then we covenanted them, particularly the lovely bit above Little Hooper's Inlet. That's a quiet little jewel which we didn't realise existed, but we used money to buy it, as one does, which is a way of saying we paid too much, but it averages out within the whole. So as an economist, that pleased me.
Right, and it's given you that extra bit of slightly different kinds of forest ecosystem. What is there that's special? Because it's actually a little bit separate to your main bit.
It's a bank at the back of Little Hooper's Inlet. A lot of Lophomertus, a steep bank, so I think not easily grazed by stock. This is the place where we find orchids, Bida orchids, green-hooded orchids. They were there in the early days. As rabbit numbers increased, they disappeared, but they've now bounced back, which is delightful. A lot of lancewood there on that dry bank, a lot of Melicope simplex, and that hosts a minute little mistletoe, dwarf mistletoe, Corthocella. It is quite different from the rest. It's not dominated by Carnica. There's quite a lot of mature totara there as well, and young totara coming away.
So we're at Papanui Inlet, which is behind us, and we're looking up the hill. We've got native bush up in front of us. We've got thick cocksfoot grass. Here we've got some totara coming up. Did you plant them, Moira?
It looks like it, but no, the birds planted those. There are mature totara either side of this grassy slope. Maybe birds were simply flying across. There's also nio. They might have been feeding on the nio berries. They self-seeded and came up when rabbit numbers were high. The grass, you can hardly believe it. It was grazed, and there was also a lot of bidibid instead of the grass. Rabbits, they dig and they scrape, so there were some quite little open areas too. I think that maybe the high rabbit numbers encouraged the totara to seed and grow. Now we've got this waist-high cocksfoot, but the totara seem to be going along quite happily.
Right, okay, so there's just that little sweet spot, really, that hit as you transitioned from one ecosystem to another. Okay, so what prompted you, John, like you and Moira, to want to really reduce the rabbit population?
Two reasons. First, the Otago Regional Council pressured us with one of their non-compliant letters. But the other reason was that ring barking of trees was very obvious and harmful and undoing a lot of the work, particularly no stock for 30 years. Rabbits were undoing that good work.
So the numbers had got really quite high then, had they?
They had. I mean, I shot 70 in 1 year from my balcony, just one a night, sort of occasionally with a thermal scope. But the numbers were obviously big, and every time we went down the drive, you felt inclined to take a shotgun because there were always rabbits.
Right. Because we don't tend to think of it as being such a big problem, you know, when you've got native forest and you're wanting to regenerate native forest, but you were actually finding that it was impacting on the trees, the new trees.
It was like furry sheep, except they were rabbits.
And were they clearing out a lot of, I guess, the understory?
Yes, they were, and this only became obvious when we took trouble to exclude them. So rabbit netting and then a helicopter drop with pindone carrot.
We had some really good advice from Pete Preston, who's a contractor. His advice was you just need to put rabbit netting around your whole property.
So this is like a fence, isn't it?
Yeah, it's quite small gauge netting. It has a skirt, a fold if you can't bury it, which goes towards the neighbour where the rabbits are coming from. Because the situation here was we had grazed paddocks on both sides of our property. Okay. Rabbits were out there to eat the grass, but coming into our place for shelter. But also
that was very kind of you.
Picking away at any broadleaf they found, or young cabbage tree, or
for extra nutrition.
That's right, for a bit of variety. So the rabbits really had everything that they needed. So Pete was quite right. We had to stop that movement of rabbits coming in. It was in total 2.2 k's of rabbit netting.
Right, so what was the cost of that, John, as the economist of the family?
Horrific. 50 metres is roughly $110, 2 kilometres worth. The arithmetic I'll leave to you, but it certainly shook the bank balance, and the tax people put a big query above the accounts for fairly obvious reasons. It was a long job, a 2-year job, but the results were quite extraordinary.
Right, so you started with the fence, and then what was the next step, Moira?
Well, as my friend said to me, you're fencing all the rabbits in, which we were. So the next stage was to poison the rabbits. For that we used pindone. It's not persistent in the ground. It has a short half-life of 3 days. But on a property like this, where you've got a lot of trees, it would have been impossible to have spread it by hand. So we had to have a helicopter drop, but all of the boundary alongside neighbouring fences, alongside a road, alongside a wetland, we had to do ourselves. So that happened 3 times in July 22. The weather was terrible because you can't spread poison if there's rain forecast. The helicopter can't work in high winds. So it was a bit fraught.
What was the space between each of the drops?
A week.
Okay.
Sometimes it wasn't quite like that because of the weather. Fortunately, our neighbour poisoned at the same time. So the truck with these huge bags of poisoned carrot was able to go onto his property. The helicopter came in, hovered, the bucket was filled, and it probably did the drop on our place within half an hour, I think. It was quite quick. We probably spent the next 2 days carrying buckets of carrot around, doing the perimeter.
Yes, because they're not allowed, the helicopter wasn't allowed to come too close, isn't that right?
That's correct, yeah. And this was possible because I suppose about a year previously I'd done my pindone handling certificate, thinking, it might be useful sometime. Well, actually it was essential to be able to do that ourselves.
So the pindone was put into a carrot kind of substrate?
The carrot is cut to a certain size, and then the pindone is a liquid which is put on top of the carrot. It's green. In fact, sometimes it was really hard to see where you had actually spread the carrot. If it was in a grassy area, you really couldn't see it. Green so that birds don't go for it.
Right. And how did you actually do it by hand for the perimeter?
We'd initially have it in sacks. We have a 4-wheel bike. We'd get as close as we could. Then it would be into buckets, carrying buckets maybe up to the top of the hill. Places we've only got very limited tracks on the property. Quite a lot of carrying. And then a gutter scoop into the bucket and then fling the carrot.
Did you get a sore arm, John?
Yes, a sore shoulder too, and also a very sore bank balance.
Well, it was a huge effort, and you didn't really get much financial support for it, did you?
We did apply to the Eco Fund, and they gave us a contribution towards the netting from Hooper's Inlet along our boundary with Allens Beach Road. The rest we paid for.
Wow, okay. But was it worth it?
Absolutely.
Interesting question.
No doubt about it.
Yeah.
When I come home and say, hey, I found these orchids, these spider orchids, these greenhood orchids, John jokingly will say, I know those $1,000 orchids, he calls them.
It does look lovely. So we'll go around to another site. So you wanted to show me where you've got some bigger trees, isn't that right?
Yep.
Right.
Okay, so where are we now, Moira?
We're standing at the base of some mahui trees. Small trees, and this shows the impact that rabbits had on these young trees. When the rabbits moved in, they demolished all of the young stuff, and once they've eaten anything green and leafy, they then go on to the bark. Mahui doesn't seem to be their top favourite. Initially, they ring-barked kowhai, quite big kowhai, perhaps 10 or 12 centimetres diameter, and they can reach surprisingly high. Lacebark was another favourite. They didn't touch the totara, they didn't seem to touch the podocarps, fortunately, and coprosma, very keen on the coprosma, and a lot of the coprosma never recovered. Mahui, a bit mixed here. We can see some small ones that have died. Others, there is some growth coming away from the base of the mahui, but they were certainly hammered. And I'm looking through at mahui stems, white, up to about 30 centimetres.
Yeah. And it seems to be a product of this edge effect, because we've got these remnants across the peninsula, and right. Therefore we've got, you can have big population build-ups of rabbits that can then move into the forest. So just to summarise then, you noticed that the population was really increasing in 2008?
That's right. Earlier on, when we planted, as we did in places, something that was particularly palatable, like a kowhai, we would have put an old tyre around it, and that was all that was needed. But then as rabbit numbers grew, you needed 2 tyres, and then you needed 3 tyres, and it was quite surprising to find rabbit pellets on the top of the 3rd tyre. And when the regional council staff person checked, they look for piles of pellets and how close they are together. They have something called the McLean scale. If you're at 3, that's acceptable, but we were at levels 4 and 5, which basically means we didn't comply. So that was the push. And I think it made us get into some areas that perhaps we didn't visit very often, because it is quite steep and not very easy to get around. And just realise, hey, there should be more on the ground. And seeing clumps of ferns just chewed down to bits, and coprosmas, ringbarked, grazed, all the bark gone. We would have ended up, maybe not we, but the future owners, would have ended up with a forest that was dominated by totara, because rabbits just didn't touch the totara, and it would have been lacking the diversity that it should have had. There would have been no broadleaf to replace the few old broadleaf that are here. There would have been no kowhai trees. So it would have been poorer as a result.
Do you think that the rabbits penetrated quite deeply into the forest?
I'm sure they did.
So ongoing, there are still some rabbits on the property, aren't there?
There are. The contractor advised that only 90% of the rabbits would eat the pindone carrot. I think we had a pretty good take here, because basically there was nothing for them to eat except tree bark and litter on the ground. We tried hard to find poisoned rabbits that were out in the open. We certainly didn't want the harrier hawks taking them, because we know that the pindone affects them. But we do see the odd rabbit now. John can shoot a few, but shooting is pretty difficult here. You've got tracks, and the rabbits just disappear into the bush. So there's not many places where you can safely shoot. So each winter, July is the time. We will do a little bit of spot poisoning where rabbit numbers have built up.
And you determine that from seeing their little piles of rabbit poo?
That's right, yeah.
Okay, but it's manageable.
Absolutely. So we're now at a stage of suppressing. We know we can't eradicate them. We also have to check the boundaries because the rabbits in some places are quite keen to get back again. Whether they see their friends through the fence, I don't know. But we have to check those. You might find a rabbit, they've started digging, so find a rock, put that in the hole, so they have to go and start somewhere else. So we can't just sit back and say, yes, the rabbit netting's there, it's not going to let anything through.
So you have to check that rabbit boundary fencing every year?
Oh, more often than that. It's the boundaries alongside a paddock, which are most at risk. I would probably want to go there once a fortnight, just to be sure.
I've been to Hinawai Reserve on Banks Peninsula a few times to see the amazing native forest that has come through gorse there. I asked Moira about the impact of gorse on this property.
Well, I'd been to Hinawai with a friend just before this place came up on the market. I'm very thankful that I had, because I came back thinking, gorse, that's no problem. In fact, it could be a good thing. It will have shaded out some of the rank grass. Here, there was quite a lot of gorse along our boundary fences. When a fence is put in, a track is bulldozed, perfect conditions for the gorse to come up. So in terms of being a good neighbour, we have gradually tried to replace it with natives, Nio particularly, then they're good and fast growing. So our technique is to cut the gorse pretty low to the ground and then just spray it with 20% glyphosate, and that stops it.
Yes, but further in the interior of your forest, you were able just to let the gorse go, weren't you?
Absolutely, and I'll be able to show you later on examples of gorse that is 3 or 4 metres tall on its last legs, surrounded by other gorse that has just died and crashed to the ground. When I look back at photos, we've got a lovely topo map actually that shows from 1942, and it shows bush on the northeast side of Varley's Hill, everything else bare. I think over time gorse and Karnika simply came up together, and we see a bit of that now. And leave it long enough and the Karnika overtakes the gorse doesn't reseed in the shade. Mahoe is also quite good at coming up through some of the older gorse and shading it out. So it's just a question of time and also having a seed source around.
Yes, having those remnant bits of bush around is so important, isn't it?
Don't have the Karnika there, as some peninsular properties don't, then the gorse is a whole lot harder to deal with.
So thank you very much for allowing me to come and visit, and you've such a beautiful place and we've seen some amazing things today. And what's next for you guys?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for coming. We've really enjoyed it. It's made us look back, I think, on some of the things in the past, go back through the diaries, and that's been enjoyable, a little bit of reminiscing about some of the early days here. What's next? There's always something to do. You find the odd box thorn or a passion fruit.
A passion fruit, yes.
Endless, yeah.
But I like that. I wouldn't want to be living somewhere where everything was finished, and this is certainly not finished.
Well, nature's never finished.
That's right.
Hopefully.
The birds are a joy. They really are. I think if keruru started nesting here, that would be quite something. Birds like brown creeper seem to be occasional. Would like to hear them more. What else can you think of?
We haven't heard the cuckoo this year, have we? Oh, you have. All right. Well, maybe I've gone deaf.
You're probably not hearing riflemen. That's probably true.
Correct, yes.
Yeah.
Well, this year there are 4 boxes occupied, which is an improvement on last year, and I've enjoyed sitting out there, just sitting there, the right distance away from a box, just watching a male and a female feeding in the Karnika. And that's absolutely delightful.
That's
so more and more of that, please, over the years. We do feel fortunate to be living here, very fortunate. You only have to look out at the window at some of the native trees, the shrubs, and listen to the birds. And we feel very lucky.
Privileged, really, is the word. Yes.
It wasn't the focus of this podcast, but I had an amazing visit with Moira and John that included seeing a beautiful dry stone wall, orchids, a family of geckos, and the panoramic view from the top of Varley's Hill. So it really was a morning to remember, and I'm so grateful to Moira and to John for their hospitality and their dedication to this precious piece of Otago Peninsula. Quick recap of what I've learned. The Otago Peninsula is a fairly dry landscape of hill pasture. It's ideal for good numbers of rabbits that are spilling into the fragmented pieces of native forest on this property, killing trees and preventing a lot of regeneration, but also helping the totara to get established in the grass. Despite their very considerable efforts, the parkers accept that they can't completely eliminate rabbits from their forest, that very good suppression is their only option. Removing rabbits has allowed the understory to come away again, and at the same time, the grass and the weeds. These complex interactions are fascinating and something I want to explore in more depth in our next episode. So thank you for listening to Rewilding in Action. I'm Maureen Howard, and in a fortnight's time, I'm back in the Otago Access Radio studio with my guests, reintroduction biologist Phil Seddon and Otago Peninsula Biodiversity Group Operations Manager Paula Cross. And we'll be talking about another mammalian species that is very well known for causing havoc in our native forests, possums. With this species, however, the Otago Peninsula is well on its way to an elimination success story. So until next time, I will leave you with sounds of birdsong from John and Moira Parker's property, Rewilders who are letting nature take the lead.
This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On the Air.